So I want to talk a little bit about the powers of chuva and Kapara for Yom Kippur. Chuva is what we do, and Kapara is what Hashem does. Chuva is our way of dealing with the mistakes we've made, repairing them, and Kapara is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu does in response to us because we've taken those steps. I want to start with a very general observation. How do we and how should we feel about guilt? People talk about the burden of guilt. And in my day, I was born before your grandparents. In my day, there was this slogan of surplus guilt. And a great deal of psychology was directed at reducing guilt, feeling that the burden of guilt was what was causing neurosis and psychosis. And if you could find a way to rid the subject of this burden of guilt, he would be psychologically much healthier. And there was a technique that they used widely, not universally, but widely, which was to say, you feel guilt because you did something, and you feel that it's wrong. We have news for you. It isn't really wrong. I know that's what you were taught, and that's what you heard when you were children from your parents, and that's what your teachers told you, but it's not true. It's just not true. It's not wrong. And since it's not wrong, there's no reason to feel guilty. So just relieve yourself of that guilt. You can do it once you realize that it's not wrong, then you stop beating yourself up over it. This is a syndrome that is unfortunately quite common, that when a parent of a young child dies, let's say a 5-year-old or a 7-year-old, the child will imagine that the child caused the parent's death. And they'll tell you, I know why my father died. Because 2 weeks before his death, he asked me to do something for him and I didn't do it. And that's why he died. I killed him. Now, if that child is bearing a burden of guilt for having killed his father, then I agree with the psychologist 100%. He didn't kill his father, and therefore he didn't do anything wrong. And therefore, maybe it's not right to have said no to your father, but that didn't result in the death. But one of the great enemies of psychology in those days, and to a certain extent still today, is religion. You feel guilty because you violated a rule of your religion, but religions are all made up. They're all phony. They're all fake. So there's absolutely no reason for you to feel guilty for violating a rule of a system that has no validity. And that's one of the reasons that they want to rid the person of the burden of his religious affiliation so that they can rid him of the burden of his feelings of guilt. And certain common elements of morality, now listen carefully, with which the psychologist doesn't agree. He'll tell the subject there's no validity to it, and therefore you don't have to feel bad about it. In this way, the psychologist is imposing his own ignorant, prejudiced, liberal views of psychology, of morality, on the patient. The patient himself is in distress. He comes to the psychologist for help. The psychologist is the one who's supposed to have the wisdom, understanding, and experience to help him. And he tells him there's absolutely nothing wrong with your interpersonal behavior vis-a-vis relationships and commitments. If someone's in a committed relationship and decides that he wants to do something with you, he made the decision. The other person's going to be injured? None of your business. Enjoy yourself. That's not obvious. You're participating in a crime where this person is violating a trusted relationship. Not obvious that you're not guilty. So the psychologist will look for a way to spread his own moral agenda, all in the name of the psychological health of the patient on the grounds that you're ridding him of guilt. Now, let me push this to an extreme. This is sometimes philosophers do this. What would be wrong with simply saying all of your guilt is unnecessary because there aren't any rules at all? There aren't any real moral rules at all. What you've been taught is valuable, isn't really. What you've been taught is wrong, isn't really. And therefore, guilt is simply a complete mistake. It's a complete mirage. Well, to put it brutally, one of the things that's wrong with that idea is that you're convinced the human being that he'd be better off living like a squirrel. One of the main distinguishing features of human beings, as opposed to the entire rest of the creation, is that we have, I'm not talking about Malachim now, that we have a sense of values, of obligations, of norms, which the other creatures don't have. And to take the position that there's no binding norms is to take the position that you're just a slightly smarter squirrel. That's all you are. And that's just, it's factually wrong, it's philosophically wrong, and certainly from a religious point of view, it's a disaster. You're denying the person's essential identity. That can't be good for him. What's good for him is that he should understand, discover his essential identity, be able to express it. Okay, so that approach to guilt is not an appropriate approach. What is an appropriate approach? Appropriate approach is a balanced approach where, on the one hand, the value of guilt and the appropriateness of guilt is recognized and acknowledged, but there's also an antidote, so that it doesn't simply accumulate and become a burden that's impossible to bear. There's a way of expelling the guilt, of dissipating the guilt. And that's what Teshuva does. Teshuva says the need for Teshuva is that you're guilty. You really did something wrong. There's something in the history book that's a stain, and it's got your name written under it. For those of you who know the tefillos. Everybody's signatures are in that book. But you could do something which wipes it out. And this is you could call it a miracle of Teshuva. What I said to some of you last week, Isaiah, when he's describing Teshuva, says, if you do Teshuva, Kadosh Baruch Hu will forgive you. And my ideas, my thoughts are not your thoughts, and your ways are not my ways. As high as the heavens are above the earth, so my ways and thoughts are above yours. And I explained what one of the things Isaiah is saying is, you don't believe this. You know what you did. You know what the consequences were. The consequences may be impossible to change. And you think that's just a fact of history that can't be overcome. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I know you think that way after I created you. So I know how your mind works. I'm telling you that even though that's the way it looks to you, it's not true. It's not true. That past can be overcome. And the guilt for it can be dissipated. So feeling the guilt is right because you really are guilty. It really was wrong. And you really did make a decision. That's realistic. And feeling bad, feeling regret, that's also good. It's also appropriate. You know, Obama, 6 months before the end of his second term, was being interviewed by a journalist. And he said to him, do you regret anything that you did in 7.5 years of presidency? He thought about it and he said, I have no regrets. That's astonishing. You know, that's lower than a snail. You never made any mistakes? Never? Not one? I could name a dozen, but maybe you could acknowledge 2 or 3. You had 7.5 years of the presidency and you never took a misstep? That's crazy.
It's hubris.
It's hubris, which is Greek for pride. It's gaiva, it's chutzpah. Now, you know, when politicians talk, almost always they're playing for the audience. They have nothing to do with what they really believe. But it should have been regarded as an abomination to say something like that. Playing on the ignorance of the listener. So taking responsibility means that you do have regret. That regret is healthy. But because tshuva is a way to rectify it, you aren't crushed by it. You're challenged by it to take the step of tshuva, which can overcome it. So in that way, the guilt becomes creative. When a person does tshuva, he really turns over a new leaf. One of the ways of describing it is that we normally understand that you can't go back and change history. And for the philosophers, you can't change the future either. You can make the future, but you can't change it. One way to look at it is you change who you are. And then that action in the past, though it's still on the books, it's still part of history. You don't have to rewrite the history books. But it doesn't relate to you anymore. So you don't bear the guilt and the pressure of that failure because you disconnected yourself from it. One of the recommendations for people to do tshuva, in the Gemara, and the Rambam brings it, is to change your name as if to say, I'm not that person. Well, if I'm not that person, then I'm not going to be crushed by the guilt for it because that guilt doesn't apply to me anymore. So this is one of the powers of tshuva that enables a person to solve the problem of guilt. Another way in which tshuva is very powerful is that people sometimes don't recognize that the requirements of tshuva are less strict than you might suppose. The Rambam says the definition of tshuva is to abandon the transgression in thought and in deed, and to regret what one has done, and to confess to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But when he describes abandoning the transgression, listen carefully to his words. He says, you should resolve in your heart not to go back to that transgression. Now, if you're reading like a lawyer, you hear something missing. But what happens in the future? What he's saying is, when you do tshuva on Yom Kippur, you should resolve in your heart not to go back to it. He didn't say the resolution will be successful. He didn't say that in the future, you will not go back to it. He doesn't say that. He says you resolve in your heart. That leaves open the possibility that the resolve will be made in Yom Kippur, and it will be sincere, honest, well-meant. But by May and June of the next year, circumstances will change, impressions will change, a person's inner strength will change, and he may fail. And that won't deprive him of having done a genuine tshuva on Yom Kippur and receiving all the benefits of tshuva, which is being disconnected from the guilt for all the past transgressions. And the Rambam goes on to say, now here he says something whose translation needs to be very carefully studied. I'm quoting now the Kesef Mishnah and the Lechem Mishnah. He goes on to say, you should take HaKadosh Baruch Hu as your witness that you will not go back to that transgression. But of course, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not testifying that what's going to be in the future. That would mean that you don't have free will. He's saying, I'm not kidding myself. I'm not rationalizing. I'm not being dishonest. I'm not deceiving myself. I'm inviting HaKadosh Baruch Hu to look to the bottom of my heart to see that I really mean it. This means, imagine a person comes to Yom Kippur and he realizes there's something on his record that needs to be addressed, and he resolves to change it, and comes next May and he repeats it again. He doesn't have to think, so I really didn't do anything on Yom Kippur. So I'm really the same person I was before. So I'm really just as guilty as I was before. Because that's a mistake. He isn't. What has really happened is this. Just as tshuva is built on a foundation that people can really change who they are, and change their circumstances. Well, if you can change and improve, you can also change and deteriorate. Both are real changes. So the improvement on Yom Kippur was a real improvement, and that means the tshuva was genuine. And then the change in May was a real deterioration, and that means the person became worse again. But that doesn't undo what he did previously. So that's one thing. And by the way, we say in the weekly prayers, Chanuna Marbel Esloach, Baruch was gracious, great in forgiving. And the Baal Tanya explains that to mean the greatness in forgiving is he'll forgive over and over again the same transgression. Even if one goes back to repeating that transgression, he'll forgive it again. Indeed, the Baal Tanya makes it in terms of a kind of mathematical, metaphysical remark. It says, when you compare a number with infinity, 2 and 62 trillion are equally nothing. So if Kodesh Baruch Hu's capacities are infinite, it makes no difference whether he forgives you once or 10 times or 100 times. Because 1, 10, 100 are equally zero when you compare them with infinity. And of course, that's mathematically true. So that's one thing about Tshuva. The other thing about Tshuva is what constitutes the resolve. Resolve not to go back to it. Suppose a person says, I know what they say now, the current slang is what triggers me. It's these and these kinds of circumstances that trigger me. I don't want to do it anymore. So I'm just going to avoid those circumstances. And he gerrymanders his life so that he makes sure not to encounter any of the triggering circumstances. And he succeeds in never doing it again. Many people, when I ask them, does that count as tshuva, think intuitively, no, that's too cheap. Tshuva ought to mean you've reorganized your priorities and you've strengthened your motivation so that when the triggering circumstance takes place, you'll be able to resist it. That's real tshuva. The other is just avoiding the problem. But it's not correct. The Rambam is quite clear that if you manage to avoid the behavior successfully, that counts as tshuva. Changing your motivation, your priorities, so you're immune, is what he calls tshuva gemura. That's complete tshuva. That's a different level. And you do not have to do that in order to be qualified as having done tshuva and reaping the benefits of tshuva. So he gives the following example, the Rambam. Imagine a person has done a transgression and he does tshuva on his deathbed. This is a standard point in the commentators. The tshuva on his deathbed. One element of the tshuva is, I won't go back to it. Let's say he knows he's dying. So he says, I won't go back to it. I promise. I won't go back to it in the next 6 hours. I won't do it. Definitely not. Isn't that trivial? I mean, if he's 32 and can expect to live another 88 years, okay, I won't go back to it. It's a sizable commitment. But if he knows he's got 6 hours left, it's enough. It's good enough. It counts as tshuva. So it isn't as overwhelming a responsibility as one might otherwise believe it to be. That being the case, since it's not as difficult as you thought, and yet it has all of the consequences that you're looking for, that means that it's very powerful. Less effort and more output means you're dealing with something that's extremely powerful. We mentioned the idea of ein davar omed b'fnei tshuva. Nothing stands in front of tshuva. A person does tshuva, it works for no matter what transgression it is. And this is epitomized in a famous passage that you all know. God hardens Pharaoh's heart so that he won't let the Jewish people go. Why does he do that? Because, says the Rambam, Pharaoh's wickedness is so great that it must be punished. And the Kodesh Baruch Hu has a commitment. Nothing stands in the way of tshuva. If Pharaoh will do tshuva, he can't be punished. Tshuva stops all punishment. Given those two principles, there's no other way out than the Kodesh Baruch Hu should stop him from doing tshuva. Understand, when I said there's no other way out, I mean, given that the Kodesh Baruch Hu has decided that tshuva should be paramount, And given that he's decided that Pharaoh has to be punished, given those decisions, it follows that this is the only course of action that's open for him. It's not that he doesn't have the power to do it. It's because of his own decisions that he made on his own that this is the only possible outcome. So you see how enormously powerful Teshuva is if once it's done, nothing can stand in its way. Menashe was a king of Israel, and he spent a period of his life worshiping idols and instituting nationwide idol worship. Of course, there was always a minority of people who were faithful to the tradition, but he did affect a lot of people. He did it in the temple as well. And at the end of his life, he did Teshuva, and he destroyed all the idols. And when he died, Chazal tells us, the angels didn't want to let him ascend to heaven, to Gan Eden, because they said what he did was so terrible, there's no way back. And the Gemara, I think Yerushalmi, says that they blocked all the routes to Gan Eden. They set up roadblocks. What did the Kodesh Baruch Hu do? And here, pay careful attention to the way Chazal describe things. Kodesh Baruch Hu dug a tunnel under the throne of glory and enabled him to come up by that route. So now you should ask, why did he do that? Why didn't he just break down the roadblocks? And the answer is because what the angels saw was true. Each angel said, this route isn't open. It isn't open. You're right. He can't come up to this route. Angels don't make mistakes, but they suffer from tunnel vision. There's another way he could come up that they didn't know. So there's blockage is true, but the blockage isn't absolute. A person who does Teshuva, no matter what he has done, that way is open for him. So that's on the side of what we do. Then there's Kapara. Now, Kapara means the person really starts new. This is where it's realistic to think that I'm no longer responsible for my failures. Because the Kodesh Baruch Hu makes this, the verses from Isaiah, makes a barrier and says, okay, that thing no longer applies to you. And if it's hard to imagine for yourself, I'm going to give you a case which you're certainly committed to and should be easy to use as leverage. According to the Rambam, Abraham discovered Kodesh Baruch Hu at the age of 40. I know you've heard about the Midrash that says 3, and the Kesef there talks about how the Rambam deals with the Midrash, but those are his words. He discovered Kodesh Baruch Hu at the age of 40, and up to the age of 40, he practiced idol worship. Idol worship is pretty bad. It's pretty bad. There are dozens of places where Kodesh Baruch Hu says that he's absolutely committed against idol worship. Is the Kodesh Baruch Hu big enough to forgive Abraham? Oh, you say, Abraham, yeah, but it's idol worship. Well, apparently, even idol worship can be forgiven. Now you say, sure, but if he came out, look who Abraham became. Now the tradition tells us you don't have to become an Abraham to have it forgiven. It could be, what you need to do is Teshuva. Abraham became spectacular, but all you need to do is to do Teshuva. So that means you really turn over a new leaf. Look what Abraham became. With an idol-worshipping background, he became one of the founders of the Jewish people, laying the foundation for receiving the Torah at Sinai. He wasn't held back by it at all. So people who have faulty things on their record have to realize that they could start over. Elisha ben Avua was a great sage, and he came under the influence of certain heretical ideas, and he saw certain things which he used as an excuse, and he ended up denying fundamentals of the Torah, and was expelled from the scholarly community, even though Rabbi Meir had still learned from him, but he was really expelled. And in the Talmudic literature, he's called Acher, the other one. He's often not mentioned by name. And at a certain point, Rabbi challenged him and said, why don't you come back? Why don't you do tshuva? And he said, I heard a voice, a voice from heaven saying that the verse that says everyone should do tshuva, that voice said everyone except Acher. That's what the voice said. So the commentators ask, okay, what should he have done? He should have done tshuva anyway, because the voice has no right to say that. That voice was put there to test him, to see what his orientation was. And I'll give you another example of this. Chizkiyahu HaMelech did something wrong, and Yeshaya Novi, prophet Isaiah, came to him and said, because of what you did, you're going to die. And Tanakh says there that Chizkiyahu turned his face to the wall and prayed to Hashem. So Yeshaya said, I told you you're going to die. And Chizkiyahu said, I have a tradition from my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, King David. And he said, never give up hope in mercy. So because he had a tradition going back to King David, he could say no to the prophet. And he was right. He lived another 22 years. So the idea that you're lost is simply a wrong idea. It's, somebody tells you you're lost, somebody tells you you have no hope, you have to say, I'm sorry, I have it on authority superior to yours, that that's not true. And Elisha ben Avu should have said that when he heard the voice coming from on high. He has to say, but I know from what I know from the tradition from Moses that that's not correct. As this is not correct, I don't have to listen to it. So these are people who did terrible, terrible things, and yet they were able. Elisha ben Avu should have, and Chizkiyahu was successful in doing tshuva. And Kodesh Baruch Hu enabled their lives to take a new start. I mentioned to some of you, but to new people here, and I think it's very important to hear. My Rebbe runs a seminary for girls and also teaches the Yerushalayim. One of the girls, I don't know which group it was from, came to her and said that she committed a terrible crime. And she's in despair over it. So my Rebbe felt she wasn't in a position to handle this appropriately, so she took her to Rabbi Gamliel Rabinovich, who was a great teacher, a great Kabbalist. She told him the story, and he said to her, your problem is you think HaKadosh Baruch Hu is too small. Too small. You think he's too small to forgive what you did. But you're wrong. He's infinite. He could forgive anything. So he's sort of framing her despair in a piece of heresy, that you're doubting HaKadosh Baruch Hu's capacity for kindness and compassion. When Moshe Rabbeinu asks HaKadosh Baruch Hu for compassion, I think it was after the spies, the sin of the spies, it says, Yigdal na koach Hashem. Let Hashem's strength be great, be big, large. That's the strength of accommodation, the strength of receiving with loving kindness, the strength of enabling repair. Let it be big. It is big. And there's nothing for which there can't be tshuva. That holds on an individual level and a national level. So when you think of coming to Yom Kippur, as I mentioned yesterday, the Day of Atonement is, I think, a poor translation, because atonement is another word for the tshuva that we do. Kippur is a word for what HaKadosh Baruch Hu does. It's not a day about what we do, though we have to do tshuva. But the theme of the day is what he does. He cleanses us. He rids us of the responsibility for the failures. So it's really us qualifying for his coming to us and cleansing us from what we've done. So at the end of Yom Kippur, a person can walk out of shul and feel that he's starting a new life. And this one of the great reasons why Sukkot is called Zman Simchaseinu, the time of our joy. It's a little puzzling when you're in your sukkah and you're talking to people. You could ask them this question: isn't it a mitzvah to have simcha on all the holidays? Yes, it is. Applies to all the holidays. So why would you call one holiday the time of our joy and not the other ones? Why would you do that? And the answer is yes, there is joy, but the joy isn't equal in its intensity and it's not equally rooted. My chavrusa, from whom I've learned any number of things, Rabbi Dr. Moshe Perkel, pointed out to me that in the Chumash, for Pesach, the Torah doesn't mention Simcha. For Shavuos, mentions it once. And for Sukkot, mentions it many times. Now, we have a way of connecting the holidays and say what's true of one holiday is true of the other holidays. But it's written by Sukkot many times, by Shavuos once, and by Pesach not at all. So obviously the text itself is telling you that the Simcha is more focal on Sukkot than it is on the other two holidays. And by the way, it's not widely known that the mitzvah of Simcha applies to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur also. Even though in the prayers we don't say the Simcha. I remember hearing this from Rabbi Soloveitchik in Boston, Zechron Livrocha, that in old texts of the Siddur it did say what is mine in the Simcha. And there's a proof of it from halacha, because someone who loses a close relative and is aveilus, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur both cancel out the aveilus. And what cancels out aveilus is the mitzvah of Simcha. So there's definitely a mitzvah of Simcha there. But of all five of them, Sukkot is the high point. And one reason for that is you're in a different condition. You're a different person. You're not weighed down with the feelings of failure. Right now, you're not a failure. And Sukkot is 4 days later. So you go into Sukkot feeling a certain shleimus, a certain wholeness about yourself. And that's one of the results of the idea of Yom Kippur. And one more thing that I want to mention to you, and then we have a little time for some questions. The person makes a resolve not to go back to that transgression. There are those who say, everybody says Hoshana Rabbah, seventh day of Sukkot, is another kind of Yom Kippur, the day of judgment. And there are those who say that the period really extends to Hanukkah. We say to one another, we Boston Hasidim, Gemara Tov, which means you should have a good ending, all the way till Hanukkah. I think part of the explanation is this. So you made a resolve on Yom Kippur not to go back to what you did. Let's test it. And there are two kinds of tests. There's a test of Kedusha and a test of Chol. The test of Kedusha is Sukkot. Sukkot is full of holiness. First of all, it's very expensive. And if you spend with the joy of being able to invest what Hakadosh Baruch Hu wants you to do, that's also a great elevation for your soul. Second of all, you live in a sukkah. You're surrounded by the sukkah the whole time. So then you have the 4 mitzvahs of Arba Minim that you take, and when you say Hallel, I mean, you're surrounded by elements of Kedusha, which require effort and expenditure, and moving out of the house into the sukkah requires a certain tolerance of less than ideal comfort. If you do all of that, and you do it wholeheartedly and with enthusiasm, that's the test of your resolve under the conditions of simcha, of kedusha, holiness. Then comes the next month, Cheshvan, which some call Mar Cheshvan. And Mar can mean sir in Aramaic, or Mar can mean bitter. And one explanation is there are no designated days in Cheshvan. None at all. No big holidays, no little holidays, no fast days, nothing. It's 6 days and Shabbos. 6 days and Shabbos, that's it. That's the whole menu for the whole month. That's plain chol, undifferentiated non-holiness. Let's put it that way. And that's another test also, because there's nothing there for inspiration. Even a month in which there's a fast day, okay, it's a special day, it connects you to history in a special way. You have an opportunity to be hopefully inspired to improve even on those fast days. So, if it's the 18th day of that month, for the first 17 days, you're thinking anticipation of it. That lifts you up. It gives you a certain direction. In Cheshvan, there's nothing. That's the test of can you maintain your resolve under those conditions. If you do that, you maintain it until Hanukkah. So then, that's a good test that the resolve was a serious resolve. Again, it doesn't have to be successful ever, but that's a test that it was a serious resolve. Okay, we have about 10 minutes there for questions. I'll be glad to try to answer them.
I was just going to mention Rav Soloveitchik, that I was thinking in my head, he's called Ish Yom Kippurim, and they said he rejoiced on Yom Kippur. So that's
yes. I've heard of other people like that as well. Who's the name of the Rav in Denver? Rabbi Meyer. I was there for 4 years, Rosh Hashanah, 3 years for Yom Kippur, and he talked about his father. He comes from German stock, and he said for his father, Yom Kippur was the greatest day of the year. He looked forward to it. So maybe it's worth mentioning because somebody asked about this recently. If you will ask an anthropologist, which I don't recommend, but if you'll ask him, he'll tell you fasting is self-flagellation. You're beating yourself up. And why are you doing that? Because you're afraid of a supernatural punishment. And you think that if you cause yourself pain, maybe the supernatural powers will leave you alone. Well, maybe that's true in deepest, darkest Africa. I don't know. I've been there. But that's not our view at all. It's not our view at all. Indeed, most healthy people on Yom Kippur, an absolute fast of about 25 hours, don't feel hungry and thirsty. The last hour and a half of the day is the Ne'ilah prayer. No one in the Ne'ilah is thinking 42 minutes to the Coke. Because you are involved in a spiritual drama which rivets you to another reality. So the way in which the fasting is experienced is, I'm free of that. I don't need that. I can turn my back on that and I'm in an exalted position anyway. That's why it's expressed as if we are like angels. That's why we say the Shema, and the verse after the Shema, which all year long you say quietly, on Yom Kippur you say it out loud. Because the Malachim say it out loud. Because you're like a Malach. So for us, the fasting in Yom Kippur is an expression of the Spirit carrying the physical. If that sounds too esoterically religious, think of sports. Anybody who does sports with any seriousness knows that 50% of your performance at least depends upon your psychological set. When you're psychologically plugged into what you're doing with confidence, you do much better. Anybody who's done any training knows that you often play music because when you're listening to music, you train better. You can run faster. You can run longer. You can do more push-ups when you listen to music. What's that got to do with your muscles? That has to do with your spirit. So the spirit can carry the physical. That's what happens in Yom Kippur. So far from being self-flagellation, it's self-exaltation. You feel exalted on Yom Kippur. It contributes to a tremendous uplift on Yom Kippur. And that's certainly not what the anthropologists talk about. Yeah, any other questions? Yeah.
Why is Yom Kippur considered a happy day if it's the day of judgment?
I'll give you an analogy. It's not a perfect analogy, but let's suppose a person, not you, but a person has symptoms, and he's been to several clinics, and they've done workups, and they can't figure out what it is, and he's suffering from the symptoms. And he finally goes to a top specialist. The specialist says, listen, you're very lucky. I've done work on 16 people like this. It's very rare. I know it. I recognize it in you right away. and I know how to take care of it. And although it may be painful, but you'll come out of it. You'll come out of it, you'll be okay. How do you feel at that moment? I think you feel pretty good. Even though he's telling you it'll be a difficult procedure, but you feel pretty good because it's in the hands of someone who knows, someone who cares about you, someone who wants your good, and you're promised a good outcome at the end. That's where the simcha is. We say on Yom Kippur at other times as well, Avinu Malkeinu, our Father first and our King second. You're coming to your Father who loves you and wants you to succeed and is investing in you so that you should be able to succeed. That closeness is something which gives the day joy. In fact, the last thing you do in Yom Kippur is to blow the shofar. That's the very last thing that happens. Kind of funny because shofar is supposed to be Rosh Hashanah. And in the right kind of siddur, that's either a Sephardi siddur or a Hasidic siddur or a Kabbalistic siddur, next to the instruction to blow the shofar are the words Siluk Shechina. Siluk Shechina means the Shechina has been present with you for the 10 days, and now it's disappearing. And when you hear that shofar blow, there's a tremendous swirl of emotions because, on the one hand, the process is over, the forgiveness sets in, the kapara of cleansing sets in, and on the other hand, you were close to Kadosh Baruch Hu during those 10 days, and that's being lost. There's a sort of poignancy in feeling that loss. So, but the closeness and the sense of being in the hands of the one who's the creator and guider and manager of history and the manager of your life, who wants to succeed, is something which can give you great joy. Yeah, I'm going to have to run because I have a simcha in Beitar. Thank you very much.
What would Rabbi recommend that we should do or think or feel on Yom Kippur other than fasting and davening?
Think of setting a new path. Orienting yourself differently, and try to live up to your priorities. And see, one of the things that I